This is The Law Show on CL 650. Now back to the show.
Yeah, welcome back. I'm Zach Spencer. You're listening to CL 650. Joining me in studio is Joe Murphy from MurphyBattista in downtown Vancouver, and from the Kelowna office, Bill Dick. Now, it's been a kind of heavy conversation here, guys, talking about doctor-assisted death in Canada and the new legislation that's being put forward by the federal government. It still has to be passed. The deadline is the end of June. Now, Joe, you're mentioning throughout the show that there's some people, you know, they say it hasn't gone far enough, this legislation. We've outlined what the legislation is, and some that say it's gone too far. So where do you think the two camps are on this? And if nobody's really happy, have you got it right?
Well, I don't think there's a middle ground that everyone involved can say we're content with this. I think philosophically some people say that nothing should be done actively to bring about the end of one's life. Let nature run its course. You've got the people, on the other hand, like the two plaintiffs that went to the Supreme Court of Canada, that said if my suffering is intolerable as an adult, I should be able to make a decision within a system that has certain checks and balances. So I don't think there is a middle ground. I think the Supreme Court of Canada has provided a roadmap to the government, and the legislation as first tabled, which was rushed because of the deadline, leaves out a bunch of people that the Supreme Court of Canada decision says should be included. So we're going to be seeing debate and litigation about this for years to come, but the two camps are never going to see eye to eye. The only thing the two camps see eye to eye on is the issue or the need to protect the vulnerable. Everybody agrees to that. If there's vulnerability, then we've got to be very, very careful that a person who's vulnerable isn't pressured in somehow to making a decision that in the end they wouldn't have made. And I had a witness, Zach, in a case many years ago who had lost his lower jaw. Mm-hmm. So when I met him, he didn't have a lower jaw and he had terrible problems. And his story was that he had gone through, he'd lost his business, his wife had left him, and he tried to commit suicide by taking a shotgun, and he was going to blow his face off, his head off. But when he went to pull the trigger, he had to tilt his head because he couldn't reach it. Therefore, when he pulled the trigger, it was the lower jaw that was blown off. And of course, he went on to live for many, many years. He survived that. And when I met him, he was fairly upbeat. So here's a fellow who at one point in his life, when he was at the very bottom, said, I want to end my life. He failed at that and was happy to then carry on. So you don't want someone making a decision that in the end they would have regretted. Mm-hmm. You can't turn the clock back and say, okay, we're going to fix this. It's like capital punishment. Once you hang a guy and discover later he was innocent, you can't bring him back.
No. There is some something in the proposed legislation around pensions, and why is that? Why is that included in the legislation?
Well, I think they're trying to protect the ability for survivors to have access to their deceased loved ones' pension, and in particular veterans and federal employees. When someone dies, the pension carries on to their survivors. And
wouldn't that happen in this case anyway?
Well, you have to, in order to get the pension, you have to die from the actual disease itself that you're suffering from. And what the federal government is aware of is that ending your own life voluntarily may cause some problems in terms of whether or not your life has ended because of a disease or for some other reason. So it's specifically put in the legislation that this act of doctor-assisted, or whether we call it end-of-life dignity or assisted death, won't impact their survivors' ability to access the pension.
It sounds to me like it's the federal government looking after federal people, right? I mean, I'm sure there's all kinds of situations at provincial level where that would be affected as well.
Yeah, and I think the federal government has certainly said that a lot of the administration of this is going to have to be done at the provincial level, which the provinces have jurisdiction over health issues and things like pensions. So I think every province is going to have to deal with all of these things at some point. And the federal government is aware of that as well. And I think they'll have to be addressed.
Now, what about a situation, speaking of the province, in British Columbia, you have something called the Family Compensation Act. That has to do with what?
The Family Compensation Act is the law that says if a person is killed as a result of the negligence of someone else, and the clearest example, a pedestrian crossing the street, hit and killed by a motorist, the ability of the family to recover damages is limited to that person's actual contribution to the family. So if you have a breadwinner who takes care of the house and does all those things, then you say, well, the family's lost the income he brings home, they've lost his services, the kids have lost his love, guidance, and affection. Those claims are larger. When you have the death of an elderly person who no one is dependent on for financial support, or a younger unmarried person who, again, no one's relying on for financial support, the law in BC says those claims are worth almost nothing. And the government has been lobbied, the governments have been lobbied for 20 or 30 years by a variety of groups, especially Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, to change that law, and they have simply not done so. So,
you're telling me if someone, say your 16-year-old was hit riding their bike by somebody driving a car, so you could go after them civilly, couldn't you?
You could, but the laws in Canada said that the death or the damages arising from the death of a 16-year-old child are almost nothing. The only exceptions to that is that in some Asian cultures, these kids are expected to grow up and take care of their parents, so those parents do have a loss, whereas the average Canadian kid doesn't grow up and take care of the parents. So if there isn't a spouse, if there aren't children, if there aren't dependents, the law as it stands today says the claim is worth very, very little.
Now, with your professional hat on here, what do you think? Should it be changed?
Oh, it should be changed. It's really insulting to suggest that the death of a person, 16, 17, 18-year-old kid, which is very common in a bad accident, to have to say to the parents the claim is worth almost nothing is so difficult, because they look at that as
they're at the beginning of their life,
the system
right?
Saying the life is worth nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no reason it can't be changed. A number of jurisdictions have substantially different damages. Ontario, for example. So why BC has stuck with this old, antiquated law, which dates back hundreds of years, I don't know, but it hasn't been just one government. It's been a series of governments, NDP and Liberal governments, that have just balked at making any changes.
Does that get marched up to our provincial Supreme Court?
The government has the right to make the legislation. So you can't go to the Supreme Court of Canada and say, tell the British Columbia government they've got to change this, because the Supreme Court of Canada would say this is their responsibility, they get to do it. In this case, it was the Criminal Code, federal legislation, and the Supreme Court of Canada looked at that and looked at the charter rights.
And I think it ties back into our last show. I think Insurance Corporation of British Columbia does have a huge influence in affecting government decisions, because it would end up costing the Insurance Corporation of British Columbia more money. And so to the degree that various governments look at that, I'm sure they're highly influenced by the Insurance Corporation. Anytime you're going to change law or policy, that's going to drive up costs and claims. And I think that's a big part of the reason why, even though it is antiquated, that we've seen no change whatsoever. There's no political will.
Because whoever, if it's under their jurisdiction, is going to get the mantle of raising rates, right?
That's the problem. The specter of raising rates is not political for any party that's going to change legislation. They live, eat, and breathe, and dine on votes. And at the end of the day, driving up insurance rates, that ICBC is going to say, hey, look, they changed the legislation, we have to raise the rates. They're not going to buy into that.
All right, we have a last couple of minutes here. We've had an interesting conversation, wrapped it up here with a more local British Columbia angle. But Joe Murphy, where do you see us headed with this doctor-assisted death in Canada?
Well, the legislation's coming, and it's not perfect, but it provides the basis for some people if they choose. And again, it's like the Oregon system. The Oregon system's been there for 20 years, but only 1 in every 300 people who die each year in Oregon use the system. But it gives someone an element of control over their life, and I think for everybody that's important.
Talking about Sue Rodriguez earlier, she kept moving the time of her death back because she got to a certain point and realized, well, I can go a little farther.
Yeah, she moved the goalposts. She thought, when I get to this point, I'm going to want to die, and she got there and said it's not that bad. So she moved it. She got to the second goalpost and said it's not too bad. It was the third goalpost that was around the time of her death.
What's amazing is the spirit of the human to survive, right? I mean, we have this just uncontrollable urge to keep going.
Yes.
Well, you know, the sad thing, I think, in all of this, as I reflect on it, is that the two plaintiffs who went to the Supreme Court of Canada are no longer here. One actually traveled to Switzerland, where Switzerland has right to die with dignity legislation and allows people from other jurisdictions to go there. And she ended her own life, and the other person died by natural causes through Lou Gehrig's disease. Just anecdotally, in Canada, it won't allow suicide tourists effectively, because you have to actually be someone who lives in Canada and has access to medical service plans. So people can't come from other jurisdictions into Canada to end their life.
Well, it's going to be interesting to watch. We have the deadline of the end of June. Joe Murphy, MurphyBattista, and Bill Dick from the MurphyBattista office in Kelowna, thank you very much for being on the show. We'll speak to you next time. I'm Zach Spencer. You're listening to CL 650.